They say that when the young man took out his gun and opened fire in a prayer meeting in Charleston, that a grandmother pushed her 5-year-old grandchild down to the floor and lay down on top of her, exposing herself and giving her child a better chance for life. And her son, age 26, tried to talk the shooter down and was shot. And the 5-year-old, no doubt terrified, lay quiet and survived. Upstairs in the pastor's office, Jennifer Pinckney was watching over her own 5-year-old play in her husband's office. Hearing the shots, she called 911, turned out the office light, and hid with her daughter under a desk. Only after the police found them and took them to a hotel across the street did she know for sure what she must have feared, which that her husband was dead. Courage. Courage under fire. The courage of self-sacrifice. The wise courage, which does not give way to anxiety, which does what needs to be done and stays out of danger. There are many kinds of courage. A person who seems to be lacking in courage is called a coward. A coward gives in to their fears, we say. It's worth noting that in popular usage lately, we've been using the word coward when we actually mean despicable, as in the 9/11 terrorists were just cowards. Now, to call someone who just died in the service of what they believe a coward would be sort of extraordinary, even if you don't believe what they believe and abhor the killing of others. But it seems that when actions of others leave us nearly speechless, the word coward is what comes to mind as the most damning thing we can say in our anger and our grief and retain our dignity and our quotability. It tells us a lot about how much we admire courage. So what is courage, and who can be called courageous? What an interesting question. I've been thinking about it now for several weeks, have seen the news in the light of those thoughts, and I'm thinking that there are 3 kinds of courage: fast courage, deliberate courage, and the courage to endure. Fast courage is the courage of battle, of police action, of house fires. It's to take the risks for the common good in the midst of danger. The people who exhibit this kind of courage often say that they don't really remember deciding to sacrifice their safety. They just acted, they said, and they often remarked that anybody would have done the same. What they seem to mean by that extraordinary statement is that they themselves didn't hesitate. They didn't experience deciding what to do. They just did what needed to be done. Lots of people, perhaps most people, wouldn't have done it for a variety of reasons, beginning with they knew they couldn't succeed at the task, or that they don't think very fast in a crisis. That would be me, who has been known to dial information instead of 911 in an emergency. Or they didn't do it because they had critical responsibilities to others and couldn't risk that sacrifice. Or perhaps they were simply afraid. Our religious compatriot, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote a poem for the July 4th, 1837 placement of a marker on the spot by the creek in Concord where, as he so memorably put it, the embattled farmers fired the shot heard round the world. They dared, he wrote, to die and leave their children free. That's courage, at the moment, the fast courage that stands in the face of danger for the common good. We admire the person who jumps off the dock to save a drowning swimmer, who pulls a buddy to safety in battle, who confronts a shooter, who jumps into the subway well to push a fellow passenger to safety. This kind of courage in special, usually split-second situations is worthy of its headlines because it reminds us all of a precious human value. Most of us will never be confronted with a situation in which it is appropriate for us to exhibit this kind of courage. And if we are wise, we will be humble about imagining what would happen if we were. Not every risk taken is courageous. Some risks are taken for show rather than for the common good. I resist calling the fellow who tightrope walks between two tall buildings courageous. I call that person an attention seeker, a thrill seeker, an adrenaline junkie, if I pay any attention at all. Some risks are taken so foolishly that no good gets done, sometimes even harm gets done. The person who dives off a dock to save a drowning swimmer is brave, but only if they themselves can swim. If they can't swim, they are foolish and perhaps even in the way of another rescue. You can't really call tilting at windmills, Don Quixote style, brave. When we think about courage, we often think first of fast courage, but that's not the only kind, and it's definitely not the most common kind of courage. There's also deliberate courage, the courage to plan to do something that is a risk taken for the common good, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold of a sleepless night, or an empty office, or walking a deserted street. This week, a man named Nicholas Winston died in England. He was 106 years old. That in itself might have made the news, but his life story was also told, or at least a few months of his life story. A few months, the beginning of World War II, when he was asked by a friend to abandon a planned ski vacation and go to Prague, which was about to be occupied by the Nazis, and help get Jewish children to safety. Mr. Winston, a brave master of logistics, ended up creating a mass rescue effort and brought more than 600 children to safety in England. It involved dangers, secret contacts with the Gestapo, bribes, forgery, 9 railroad trains, an avalanche of paperwork, and a lot of money. In the end, he got exasperated with the slow-moving British bureaucracy, and he simply forged entry permits for his children. This was a long-term crisis, and although some of the work was done from the safety of his home in England, some involved real danger. Mr. Wilson didn't talk about that part of his life. Indeed, he actively hid it for 30 years, even from his family. When his wife found a box of mementos while cleaning out the attic and insisted on hearing the story and sharing what he told her with others, Mr. Winston got a lot of attention. He got knighted even, and well-deserved. It seems likely that he had more than a few sleepless nights in the months that he worked, wondering just how much danger he had put himself in. But he didn't seem to remember that. In an interview in the New York Times in 2001, he said, "Well, one saw a problem there, that a lot of those children were in danger, and you had to get them to a safe haven, and there was no organization to do that. Why did I do it? Well, why do people do different things? Some people revel in taking risks, and others go through life taking no risks at all." Although it may seem that those who decide, suddenly or deliberately, to take risks for the common good, that anyone would do it, and there was really no decision to make at all, that does not actually mean that this kind of courage comes out of the blue, or that all humans are equally likely or unlikely to exhibit it under fire. There was an interesting study done years ago with people who had taken in Jewish families during the Holocaust, at great risk to themselves. Researchers asked questions later about their values, their parents' values, their upbringing, and so on, to try and find out why they had done it when many of their neighbors had not. I couldn't find that study this week, but I remember reading about some of the results. What researchers found most vividly was that those willing to take the risks of saving that someone in their culture considered an other had been raised in homes and schools where there were people who were different from them. They knew from experience at the dinner table, that the teaching that all people are human beings like themselves was true. Because of their cosmopolitan and compassionate upbringing, their hearts were already big enough to hold self, family, country, and strangers. Courage comes from the Latin word cur, heart. To have courage is to have and act on a big heart. A heart for a buddy, for a Jewish child otherwise condemned to death, for a hapless swimmer, or a poor soul hanging out of a burning window. Sometimes the big heart we have to have is for ourselves, to act on the basis of our own needs and good. The person who takes the risks of leaving abuse, of abandoning drink, of getting healthy, of leaving toxic relationships, that's also courage. Being a healthy, sturdy human being is just as much a part of the common good as raising a healthy, sturdy child, or rescuing a person from death, or righting a common wrong. It takes discernment to take risks to better our own lives, especially if we are doing it in the face of opposition. But our health that is created thereby ripples out, sometimes spectacularly, to the world. Consider young Malala of Pakistan, who spoke out for her right to go to school and for other girls to go to school, and who was shot. Her nation reacted in outrage, the world with compassion, and after she had recovered, she had a chance to speak to the UN on the importance of schooling. That's a very dramatic example of both the potential cost and the potential benefit of speaking up for oneself, taking risks for one's own good. Most often, the risks we take are to relationships, and the benefits are to those around us. But you never know. We are all connected. Caitlyn Jenner was given the Arthur Ashe Courage Award when she, who had been Bruce Jenner, the athlete, asked the world in a very public way to accept her as a woman. The Arthur Ashe Courage Award is named after the first African-American professional tennis player who firstly endured the nearly unending racism in the world of tennis, and then, after contracting AIDS from a blood transfusion before that disease was well understood, went to bat against the prejudice and fear that was rampant in society in the early 1990s. Both of those roles took great long-term courage. And of course, courage is one of the many traits that comes into play when a person develops a lethal illness. I'm not sure how much courage it took for Bruce Jenner to come out as Caitlyn. My sense is that the courage required to become Caitlyn was much more critical earlier in her life, before transgender was even a word, much less a social phenomenon. But there was another rather extraordinary display of courage going on around this bit of news, and that's the courage of Sam Lamott, the much written about, now young adult son of popular author Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott was not comfortable with some part of the Jenner transition, and she tweeted her thoughts in an unfortunately crude way to her enormous audience. And her son had the courage to weigh in. He responded to her in a tweet, in public, that her tweet is not truth or love or funny. I'll explain it to you later. Let's start by deleting it. And then he tweeted something which will probably go down in history as a quotable quote. You can be part of the noise, but when the noise quiets down, you'll wish you were a part of the change. It lasts longer. And while he educated his mother in private, he also fielded the outraged sensibilities of his mother's liberal fan base. Everybody gets to make mistakes, he wrote. It's a shame this lesson is so public, but the best lessons are often painful and embarrassing. And I know, it's shocking. When the adrenaline wears off, remember that before you knew about trans issues, you didn't know. This is a deliberate, long-form courage, a kind of interpersonal courage. That is, the taking the risk not of bodily safety, but of losing a precious relationship. It's a deliberate courage of the moral kind, taking a risk to do what's right, even to try and make a wrong right, taking the risk to stand up for the wrongdoer amidst her outraged fans. Most of us never see a battlefield. We're not responders to house fires. We never see children about to die. But all of us have regular occasions to take moral and interpersonal risks. We have the opportunity to try to right the many wrongs around us, to deliberately wade into the social fray for the common good. And then there's the courage of endurance, the courage to live in pain, the courage to stay in it for the long run, whatever it is, the courage to finish, to fail and try again, to go back for yet another treatment, to stay with another's distress, to deal wisely with what will not change. The courage of endurance, like other kinds of courage, can be misplaced. You can endure something that you shouldn't endure, that does nothing but damage you, or that serves evil rather than good. Sometimes we think we are bravely enduring something that others, or even later we ourselves, see as having been in denial. Courage doesn't always roar, Mary Ann Radmacher said. Sometimes courage is the little voice at the end of the day that says, I'll try again tomorrow. My colleague, UU minister and Army chaplain George Tiger, spoke of the endurance to men and women deployed to Afghanistan in the reading. Even there, he pointed out, most of them did not face the need to muster fast courage. The courage they exhibited was the courage of endurance, hard weather, hard benches, loneliness, boredom, getting up each morning and doing the same difficult or painful or tedious thing away from home again. A sacrifice, an action made sacred by loss and love. The courage to endure is a common kind of courage. To take what is and face it, to find what is good in it, and to keep on keeping on. Most of us have to draw on all of our stores of that kind of courage at least a few times in our lives. And that kind of courage is honed by small endurances, hopefully from childhood. Children who face some adversity in childhood, a disability or a struggle, learn this by necessity and early. Children for whom everything is smooth sailing, or who get their every whim catered to, sometimes don't get to practice the courage of endurance until they meet the sometimes unforgiving school of hard knocks. But there is just as much mystery about the courage of endurance as there is about the other kinds. And while we can admire the courage we see all around us, we want always to have compassion for those who can't muster it, for who knows all there is to know about another's life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote of the courage of the farmers, ended his poem with a prayer. And in that prayer, we see his belief that courage is not only a virtue, but a gift of spirit, which, like most such gifts, is unevenly and often surprisingly given. He ended his poem, "Spirit that made those spirits dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare this shaft we raise to them and thee." On this 4th of July weekend, let us honor all the courage we see around us. From the courage of those who fought to make this land free, the courage of those who endure great difficulty, who try again, who free themselves, who serve others, who take risks for the common good. Let us honor the courage we find in ourselves to do the same.